Imagine a galaxy so ancient, it's forgotten more empires than our history books have ever known. For billions of years, civilizations rose, conquered the stars, and crumbled into cosmic dust. By the time humanity finally reached for space, the entire galaxy was already carved up like a cosmic pie, and we weren't even invited to the table. The rules were set. The pecking order was established, and at the very top sat a species called the Vithkai. This is the story of how the new kid on the block, the ultimate underdog, decided to flip the whole board. You're going to want to hear how this ends. The Vithkai were the undisputed kings. Picture tall, imposing figures with skin like polished gray stone and 4 piercing eyes that missed nothing. Their empire wasn't just big. It was colossal, spanning 40,000 star systems with a navy of millions of warships. For 18,000 years, they'd been in charge, and they had no plans of retiring. Just below them were the Arathi, beings made of living crystal that grew over centuries from tiny seeds into magnificent, towering forms. They were ancient and wise, and they'd learned the hard way that the best way to survive the Vithkai was to never, ever challenge them. Being useful was safer than being a threat. And then you had the real weird ones, the hollow minds. No one even remembered what they used to look like. They ditched their physical bodies eons ago, and now existed as pure thought, drifting in the void between stars. They were cosmic supercomputers, observing and calculating, but they rarely got involved in the messy business of mortals. A whole bunch of other species filled the ranks below them, bug-like creatures, fish-like aliens, beings made of silicon, you name it. They had all found their little niche in the galactic hierarchy and learned to play by the unspoken rules to stay alive. And at the absolute bottom were the newcomers, the young races just poking their heads out of their home planets. The old guard watched these newbies like hawks. Most of them would mess up sooner or later. They'd get too ambitious, demand too much, or just forget to bow to the right people. When that happened, they were contained. It's a nice, clean word, isn't it? But containment could mean anything from crippling sanctions to having your entire planet turned to glass from orbit. When humanity blundered onto the scene 300 years ago, our first faster-than-light ship accidentally stumbled right into Arathi territory. Luckily for us, the crystal beings were more curious than hostile. They looked at these soft, squishy creatures from some backwater yellow star and basically patted us on the head. We were given observer status in the Concordant, which was their fancy name for a galactic council. It was mostly a club for the elder races to keep the younger ones in line. For us, it meant we could show up, trade a little, and not get vaporized on sight. For 3 centuries, humanity played the part perfectly. We were polite, we made small talk, we kept to ourselves, and we never stopped asking questions, which the elders found kind of cute. Humans were endlessly curious. How do your star drives work? What's the most powerful energy source you can build? How do you grow those incredible living spaceships? What secrets have you learned after 1,000,000 years of thinking? The ancient races would humor us with some answers, but kept the really important stuff to themselves. They weren't worried. To them, we were a tiny species stuck in one solar system with maybe 50 billion people, a rounding error in their populations of trillions. Our tech was a joke. Our military was a pop gun. We were absolutely no threat. And that's exactly what Ambassador Sarah Chen wanted them to think. When she was just 32, she stood in the Grand Assembly on the Vithkai homeworld. surrounded by beings who were exploring the galaxy when her ancestors were figuring out pointy sticks. She smiled. She was gracious. She said all the right things. But inside, she was taking very careful notes. You see, Sarah was part of a secret project, something so deep underground, it didn't even have a name. It was a network of people spread throughout every part of human society, from diplomats to scientists to school teachers, and they all knew the truth. Humanity wasn't just observing. We were studying, we were learning, and we were planning. It all began just 50 years after we first met the aliens. A secret group of our best historians and strategic thinkers was given one job: analyze galactic history and figure out the odds. Their findings were horrifying. Once you knew what to look for, the pattern was terrifyingly clear. New species would pop up, show some promise, get a little too smart or a little too powerful, and then, one way or another, they would just disappear. Take the Kasari, who lived 3 million years ago. They had this amazing biotech, growing weapons and ships from living things. The Vithkai watched them for 10,000 years. The moment the Kasari looked like they could become a real competitor, the Vithkai made their move. The official history says the Kasari were wiped out by a series of unfortunate plagues. Funny how that happens. Then there were the Yol, who made the mistake of actually asking for a voice, for equal rights in the Concordant. The Vithkai's answer was brutally simple. The Yol homeworld is now a radioactive cinder, with a permanent Vithkai fleet parked overhead, and the survivors are scattered refugees. The singing moons of Turs were even more tragic. They were a hive mind, a consciousness spread across a dozen planets. They never bothered anyone, never asked for anything. But their very existence was just too different, too alien. The hollow minds ran the numbers and decided they might one day become unpredictable. And that was a death sentence. The war to wipe them out was called a stabilization effort. It ended with the complete and total extinction of a unique form of life. None of this was a secret. The old races didn't hide their dirty laundry. They just framed it as galactic pest control. Young species are chaotic, they'd say, and chaos is bad for business, so they have to be managed. Our secret analysts ran thousands of simulations. Every single time, the conclusion was the same. Sooner or later, 1,000 years from now, maybe 10,000, humanity would cross some invisible line. We'd invent the wrong tech, expand too fast, or just look at someone the wrong way. And then it would be our turn to be contained. The question was, what could we possibly do about it? Some said we should just accept our fate, be useful, like the Arathi, and hope they keep us around as pets. Others argued we should run and hide in some dark corner of the galaxy, but neither of those options felt right. Being a servant meant living under a constant threat, and hiding was a fool's errand. The elders would find us eventually, but the computer models spit out a third option. It was insane. It was borderline impossible. It would require our entire society to sacrifice and work in secret for centuries. But it was the only path that gave us a fighting chance. They called it the Prometheus Initiative. The concept was terrifyingly simple, but the execution was mind-bogglingly complex. Humanity would secretly, over generations, build a military so powerful, so overwhelmingly advanced, that not even a coalition of all the elder races could stop it. We would hide every factory, every ship, every breakthrough until the very last second. Then we would reveal our hand all at once and give the galaxy a choice: treat us as equals or face total annihilation. It was a gamble on a scale the universe had never seen, and it meant humanity had to change everything about itself right under the noses of our ancient observers. First came the resources. Building this ghost fleet would take a huge chunk of our entire economy, and it all had to be off the books. Our best economists spent decades creating a shadow financial system of ghost companies and fake transactions. Secret factories were built inside hollowed-out asteroids. Hidden supply chains stretched across our system, completely invisible to any official records. The second problem was tech. Our science was centuries behind theirs. This had to stop, but any change had to be invisible. So, humanity's top scientists created research teams with mind-numbingly dull official titles, like agricultural output studies or atmospheric forecasting. But their real work was hidden, buried in labs deep beneath the Earth's crust or floating silently in the void between stars. They were making discoveries that would rewrite galactic history, and they told absolutely no one. The biggest challenge was the secrecy itself. How do you keep a secret from civilizations that have been watching the stars for millions of years? You do it with patience and a whole lot of misdirection. Humanity leaned into the role the ancient empires expected them to play. We acted scattered and clumsy. We put on a show of fighting over petty squabbles. We let our public technology fall generations behind what we were truly creating in the shadows. Ambassador Sarah Chen played this part for 40 years. She sat through thousands of mind-numbing meetings and forced a smile at 10,000 diplomatic parties. Every scrap of information she gathered was sent back to Earth, and she carefully fed the galactic titans the exact story they wanted to hear. There were days she wondered if the cost was too high. The sacrifices were staggering. Entire generations lived and died for a project they would never see finished. Children grew up knowing their life's work would only benefit their distant descendants. People poured their souls into secret facilities that, on paper, didn't even exist. But then, she'd remember the stories of the Kasari, the Yule, and the tragedy of their singing moons. She'd remember what happened to every species that couldn't stand up for itself. And just like that, she'd be back to smiling at Vithkai ambassadors, pretending to be amazed by gadgets that human scientists had quietly made obsolete decades earlier. The years flowed by. Decades melted into centuries. The Prometheus project grew in the darkness, nurtured by the silent promise of billions of people who knew exactly what was on the line. In the Oort cloud, a frozen wasteland far beyond the last planet, a new kind of creation began. The human engineers staring at the blueprints thought they had to be insane to even try it. Their grandparents had started this mission. Their grandchildren would be the ones to see it through. That's just how long it takes to forge a weapon that can look the entire galaxy in the eye. Back on Earth, life went on. People went to their jobs, raised their kids, and grumbled about paying taxes. The vast majority of them had no clue that a huge slice of their economy was being siphoned off to build the impossible. The secret was guarded by a surprisingly small circle of people, bound by the terrifying knowledge of what would happen if they failed. And in the grand chambers of the galactic government, the ancient empires kept writing humanity off as a curious little footnote. We were too young, too small, and far too primitive to ever be a threat, which was exactly what humanity was counting on. High Observer Kael Vanos of the HFY Security Division scanned his yearly report on minor species. Humanity was mentioned on page 47, squeezed between a newly catalogued fungus from Epsilon Hydri and the fading remnants of some old trading guild. The report said human economic growth was up about 2%, a little less than the galactic average. Their tech was still considered rudimentary. Their military was a joke, just a few dozen patrol boats that could barely defend their own system. Kael Vanos initialed the report without even bothering to read the section on humans. He had bigger fish to fry. Rumors were swirling about trouble in the Mortith territories. The cryptic Hollow Minds had said something about approaching singularities that needed to be decoded. He had real threats to deal with. He didn't find it odd that humanity's economy had grown by exactly 2% every single year for the last 100 years. Never more, never less. He never questioned how such a famously messy species could pull off that kind of consistency. He never asked where all the brilliant graduates from human engineering schools were disappearing to, or why humanity had mysteriously stopped all deep space exploration 30 years ago. No one asked, because no one believed humanity was worth a second look, and so the secret was safe. Year after year, decade after decade, the most audacious project in human history moved forward in total darkness. The original workers grew old, training their replacements before they retired. Governments on Earth rose and fell. Each new leader was quietly brought into the circle, and each one accepted the heavy burden. Babies born after the project began were now middle-aged, planning for their own retirements. The work never stopped. Ambassador Sarah Chen passed away at the age of 112. She never got to see the finished product of the secret she guarded her entire life, but she died with a smile, knowing her own granddaughter had been chosen to serve on the crew of one of the great ships. The HFY celebrated the 18,000th anniversary of their empire with a party that lasted for an entire year on their home world. They toasted their own genius and power. They gazed out at the galaxy they owned and saw nothing but clear skies ahead. They had no idea that their greatest challenge was already built, silent and waiting in the dark, and that the insignificant species they'd ignored was about to change the universe forever. Admiral Chen Weyan stood on a bridge that didn't officially exist, staring at the impossible made real. Through the reinforced viewport, she watched the hull of her ship curve away from her, stretching so far that it disappeared over its own horizon, a horizon that was 3,000 kilometers away. She was standing inside a man-made moon. They called this one Prometheus. It was the first of 12. Wei-Yin was 67 years old. Her entire life had been a training exercise for this very moment. Her grandmother, Ambassador Sarah Chen, had died before the first steel plates were even forged. Her mother spent 40 years in the propulsion division. Wei-Yin herself had joined as a rookie engineer at 22, working her way up the ranks to command the single most powerful vessel humanity had ever conceived. There were still moments it felt like a dream. She pressed her hand against the viewport, feeling the faint hum of construction vibrating through kilometers of solid hull. Outside, swarms of automated builder bots flowed like rivers of mercury across the ship's surface, weaving on new layers of armor and technology. Each swarm was made of millions of tiny units, all working in perfect, silent harmony. They never stopped. They never got tired. They had been building non-stop for nearly a century. Director Marcus Webb, a man older than Wayan, with tired eyes that had seen far too many secrets, came to stand beside her. He was the mastermind behind the entire Prometheus project, the conductor of a secret orchestra of millions. "The latest numbers are in," he said, handing her a data slate. "We're actually ahead of schedule, for the first time in 30 years. Wei-Yin swiped through the data. Power core at 94%. The main weapon systems were being fitted into the forward sections. Life support was stable enough to sustain 2 billion souls forever. And the engines, those beautiful, impossible engines, were in their final calibration stages." "What's the timeline for full operational status?" she asked. 3 years for Prometheus," he replied. "The other 11 are coming along. The last one, Athena, won't be ready for another decade. But we'll have more than enough power to make a difference long before then." Wei-Yin nodded. This was all part of the plan. The only question left was whether the universe would play along. She thought of the incredible journey it had taken to get here. 90 years of secret labor, 90 years of hidden genius, 90 years of quiet sacrifice from people who knew they were building a future they would never get to see. The first few decades were the real struggle. Humanity had to invent entirely new fields of science just to get started. What we knew at the time wasn't nearly enough to build something like Prometheus. The key came from the most unexpected place. A brilliant young physicist named Yuki Tanaka had been exploring the theoretical edges of gravity manipulation. The ancient empires had artificial gravity, sure, but their tech was clunky, built on old, limited principles. Tanaka discovered a completely new path, a way to create gravitational effects that were orders of magnitude more powerful. Her breakthrough changed absolutely everything. If you could properly control gravity, you could create artificial mass. If you could create artificial mass, you could literally bend space-time. And if you could bend space-time, you could do things the galactic titans didn't even think were possible. Tanaka had died young. A candle burned at both ends by the sheer intensity of her work. But her spirit lived on in every system humming aboard Prometheus. The ship's incredible drives were born from her equations. So were the gravity fields that made life inside this metal giant feel just like home. And so were the weapons. The weapons were what truly made Prometheus a ghost in the dark. Wei-Yin walked down the observation deck to a section overlooking one of the main weapon installations. From this far away, it looked almost elegant, a soft curve of metal and shimmering crystal the size of a small city. But she knew the truth of what it could do. The primary cannons on a Prometheus-class vessel were designed to fight on a scale the ancient empires couldn't even comprehend. These weren't built to fight other ships. They weren't even built to destroy planets, though they could do that with ease. These were weapons designed to whisper threats to suns. The physics were shockingly straightforward. At their heart, stars are just fusion furnaces, balanced by gravity's immense pull. If you mess with that balance, the star has no choice but to react. Crank up the heat, and it bloats like a balloon. Cool it down, and it shrinks. And if you push it just right, you can make it go nova. The Prometheus was armed with 3 separate ways to do just that. It could murder a star, wiping out everything for light years around. It could trigger solar flares with pinpoint accuracy, like a cosmic sniper. And, in theory, it could destabilize a star so completely that it would collapse into a black hole. Of course, none of these apocalyptic weapons had ever been fired at full strength. There was no way to practice without the whole galaxy noticing. But the math was solid, checked and double-checked by generations of our brightest minds. They'd run millions of simulations. When the button was pushed, the weapons would work. The hope, the prayer, was that they'd never have to. This was about deterrence. It was about making the ancient, arrogant elder races finally understand that an attack on humanity would be their last. She kept walking through the cavernous ship. The inside of Prometheus was a world unto itself, a mobile civilization. It had neighborhoods that could hold entire cities, agricultural bays that could feed billions, and factories that could churn out anything we could ever need, from advanced medicine to entire fleets of smaller warships. The whole idea was for every Prometheus-class ship to be an ark, completely self-sufficient. If Earth fell, if the absolute worst happened, our species could live on, wandering the stars forever. We would be a ghost civilization, impossible to catch, impossible to kill. Wyan arrived at the command center, a huge chamber buried deep in the vessel's heart. Hundreds of stations sat in sweeping circles around a central platform. For now, most were dark and empty. Just a skeleton crew was on hand to watch over the final stages of construction. But in 3 years, this room would buzz with the finest officers humanity had ever produced, all of them commanding a weapon that could bring the galaxy to its knees. Commander David Park was standing watch on the central platform. He was young for his rank, only 35, but he'd earned it in 1,000 simulated battles. He was slated to be Wyan's second in command once Prometheus went live. "Admiral," he said with a crisp salute, "we've got the latest intelligence briefing from Earth. Anything I need to worry about?" Park paused for a fraction of a second. "The Vithkai have stepped up their surveillance of our outer system. Nothing overt, but they've shifted their sensor platforms. We think they might be picking up on some anomalies." Wyan's brow furrowed. This was the nightmare scenario. They had been so careful to hide their work, but you can't hide something this big forever. All it would take was one curious Vithkai scientist asking the right question. What kind of anomalies? Energy signatures, mostly. The construction drones give off a ton of waste heat. We've been trying to bleed it off slowly, but some of it must be getting out. Plus, there are minor gravitational shifts. Prometheus is heavy enough to tug on things nearby. Have they sent anyone to investigate? Not yet. Our diplomats have been busy feeding them cover stories. Industrial accidents, experimental mining projects, you know the drill. And for now, they seem to be buying it. For now. 2 of the most dangerous words in the universe. Wyan had made a career out of studying galactic history. The Vithkai were patient, but they weren't fools. If they got truly suspicious, they had more than enough resources to come sniffing around. And if they found out what humanity was building out here in the dark, they wouldn't stop to ask for an explanation. "Keep me posted on every single development," she ordered. "And step up our contingency plans. If we need to move up the launch date, I want us to be ready." Park nodded and got back to his console. Wyan lingered in the command center, her mind racing with all the ways this could fall apart. The biggest weakness in this grand plan had always been the people. Keeping a secret of this magnitude meant relying on millions of individuals across generations, not to make a single mistake. Any one of them could have betrayed the project. Any one of them could have let something slip to the wrong person, or left a file on the wrong computer. But somehow, They hadn't. For 90 years, through political turmoil, economic disasters, and countless crises, the secret held. Wyan often wondered how they'd pulled it off. She had seen humanity's dark side, all the greed and conflict that seemed to be our default setting. How did a species like that come together for something so massive, for so long? The answer, she figured, was fear. Not the fear of being punished, but the terrifying, gut-wrenching fear of what would happen if they failed. Everyone working on this project knew the stakes. They'd all seen the historical archives. They knew what the elder races did to up-and-coming species they saw as a threat. The fear of total annihilation was a hell of a motivator. But it was more than that. It was something Wyan had a hard time defining. Maybe it was pride, or a stubborn kind of hope. The people building Prometheus weren't just running from extinction. They were trying to build a future. They were trying to change the fundamental rules of a galaxy that had been governed by violence for billions of years. Maybe that was hopelessly naive. Maybe the elder races would just swat humanity aside regardless of what we built. Maybe there was no escaping the cold, brutal math of the cosmos. But Wyan refused to believe that. She had to believe that humanity could be different. She had to believe that the terrible weapons they were building were the very things that would guarantee they were never used. She believed that one day, decades or even centuries from now, her descendants would look back at this moment as the turning point when everything changed for the better. She left the command center, taking a transport pod to one of the science divisions. This was where the real magic was happening, where scientists were shattering the known laws of physics. Dr. Yuki Tanaka II was there to meet her, named for her great-grandmother, the legendary physicist whose theories had started it all. She had the same sharp, intelligent eyes and the same burning intensity. "Admiral, you need to see this." They walked down hallways packed with equipment, so advanced Wyan couldn't even guess its function. The research section was a universe of its own, populated by people who spent their entire lives asking questions no one else had even thought of. "We've had a breakthrough in communications," Tanaka said, her voice electric with excitement. "Quantum entanglement. Instantaneous, untraceable communication across any distance. They'll never even know we're talking." The implications hit Wyan like a physical blow. "We could coordinate the entire fleet in perfect real time. No signal delay, no chance of being intercepted." "Exactly. But there's more," Tanaka continued. "We figured out how to use the technology for more than just talking. We can use it for sensors. Imagine being able to see anywhere in the galaxy instantly. No more wondering what the Vuthkai are up to. No more fear of being discovered. How soon can we have it? We're installing the first units right now. By the time Prometheus is ready to fly, she'll have the full package." For the first time in a long time, Wyan felt a spark of something she rarely allowed herself: optimism. Every new advantage like this, every brilliant breakthrough tilted the odds just a little more in their favor. But she was too seasoned to let her guard down. The elder races hadn't held on to their power for millions of years by being sloppy. They possessed technologies humanity couldn't even dream of. Our only real weapon was surprise. She spent the rest of her day touring the ship, getting updates from department heads and reviewing status reports. And everywhere she looked, she saw the same thing: people working with a quiet, unshakable focus. They all knew what they were building. They all knew why it was so important. They didn't need inspiring speeches. They just came in and did their jobs day after day, year after year. As the ship's artificial night fell and the lights dimmed across the massive vessel, Wyan went back to her quarters. They were simple for a flag officer, but she'd never been one for luxury. All she needed was a bed, a desk, and a viewport that looked out on the relentless 24-hour construction. She thought of her grandmother, who spent her life bowing and scraping to alien dignitaries, all while secretly plotting to give humanity the teeth it needed to survive. She thought of her mother, killed in an accident at one of the deep space construction sites, another anonymous sacrifice for the cause. She thought of the countless others who had poured their lives into this project, never living to see it finished. 3 more years. After 90 years of struggle and sacrifice, the finish line was finally in sight. Wyan stared out the window at the distant stars, glittering beyond the swarm of construction bots. Somewhere out there, the Vuthkai were living their lives, completely confident in their power, convinced they ruled the galaxy. They had no clue their universe was about to be turned upside down. She prayed they would make the right choice when the time came. She prayed the threat of Prometheus would be enough, that the weapons would remain silent forever. She hoped humanity could introduce itself to the galaxy as an equal, not as a destroyer. But if they were backed into a corner, if the elder races chose violence over peace, she wouldn't hesitate for a second. She had spent her entire life training for this. She knew exactly what was at stake. Imagine working in secret for a century, preparing to finally step on to the galactic stage, only to have the biggest empire in the galaxy decide to wipe you out before you even get the chance. That's the nightmare humanity was about to face. In just 3 years, Admiral Chen Lin dreamed of revealing humanity's true strength, a future her grandmother died fighting for. But on the Vuthkai capital world, a high executive named Rethanos sat in his dark study, staring at screens that told him humanity's time was up. And you're not going to believe what he found, so stick with me to see how this all goes down. For Rethanos, light was for show. Here, alone, all that mattered was the data. And the data was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the human race. He'd been digging into it for 3 full years, ever since a junior analyst flagged what she thought was a minor accounting error in humanity's economic reports. Instead of a promotion, Rethanos quietly moved her to a top-secret research team and took over the investigation himself. What he uncovered was deeply unsettling. The amount of wealth humanity claimed to be producing just didn't match the infrastructure they had. Now, that wasn't unheard of. Corruption could easily explain gaps like that. But this was different. For nearly 100 years, humanity's economic growth was reported at exactly 2%, not roughly 2%. Exactly 2%, down to the 4th decimal place, year after year. No species was that consistent. Economies fluctuate, populations boom, technology advances in fits and starts. To achieve that kind of perfect stability meant someone was cooking the books on a planetary scale, a feat that should have been impossible for a species as politically messy as humanity. Then there was the energy problem. Rethanos had pulled records from Vuthkai sensors all over the region. The energy pouring out of the Sol system had been skyrocketing for decades, growing way faster than their official economy. So where was all that power going? He found supply ships that would simply vanish. A freighter loaded with raw materials would leave a mining colony and poof, disappear from all tracking systems. Weeks later, it would reappear, empty, with no record of its destination. He also noticed that the number of scientific papers published by humans had plummeted by 60% in the last century, even though their universities were churning out more scientists than ever. Where did all those brilliant minds go? What were they all secretly working on? The full picture was still a mystery, but the outline was terrifyingly clear. Humanity was hiding something enormous, a project that was consuming resources on a scale that made their official civilization look like a joke. Rethanos tried to think of a simple explanation. Maybe the humans had found some incredibly rich new resource and were keeping it quiet for a market advantage. Or maybe they'd invented a revolutionary new technology and were waiting to establish a monopoly. Both were classic moves for a young, ambitious species. But a darker possibility kept nagging at him, one he couldn't ignore. What if humanity had looked at the brutal history of the galaxy and come to the same cold conclusion as every other realist? What if they understood exactly what happens to species that challenge the old guard? And what if they were secretly getting ready to fight back? That idea was chilling because it suggested a level of long-term planning the Vithkai had never imagined humans were capable of. It meant their image as a disorganized, weak species might have been a carefully crafted illusion, maintained for 300 years. It meant everything they thought they knew about humanity could be a lie. Rethanos knew what he had to do. He requested a meeting with the Circle of Executives, the absolute authority in the Vithkai Empire. The chamber they met in was ancient, carved from the planet's bedrock 8,000 years ago. Its walls covered with the names of every civilization the Vithkai had conquered. The room was a monument to their power, a reminder that they had been crushing challenges for a very, very long time. The 7 executives, their gray skin almost blending into the dim light, sat waiting. These were the most powerful beings in their empire, and at 300 years old, Rethanos was the baby of the group. "You called this emergency session," the first executive, Keith Mora, said in a gravelly voice. "We trust you have a compelling reason." Rethanos didn't waste a word. He activated his presentation, and holographic displays filled the air, showing them everything he'd found. "Humanity is hiding something," he began. "I don't know what it is yet, but the scale of it is colossal. I believe they may be preparing for war." He laid out all the evidence: the impossibly perfect economy, the missing energy, the ghost ships, the silent scientists, and the strange gaps in sensor coverage that the humans seem to know about and use to their advantage. The executives listened without a flicker of emotion, their faces impossible to read. When Rethanos was done, Keith Mora was the first to speak. "What is your assessment of the threat level?" "Unknown," Rethanos admitted. "And that's what terrifies me. We've been watching them for 3 centuries, and we still have no idea what they can do." That alone was a red flag, a species that Young shouldn't have been able to hide anything from them. Executor Vithal, the head of the military, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting the humans have been intentionally deceiving us, that this has all been an act?" "I'm suggesting we have to consider it a possibility," Rethanos replied. Vithal scoffed. "Why? They're trapped in one system. They have no allies. Their tech is primitive. What could they possibly think they could accomplish?" Rethanos had wrestled with that same question. "Survival," he said, the word hanging in the ancient chamber. "They know what we do to species we see as a threat. Maybe they decided to become a threat in secret and wait until they were strong enough to show their hand." "Strong enough for what?" Vethal demanded. To challenge the entire Concorded. I don't know, Rethanos said. But I don't think we should wait around to find out. The debate raged for hours. Some executives urged caution, wanting more data before they acted, but others argued that waiting just gave the humans more time to finish whatever they were building. The safest play was to strike now, hard and fast. In the end, they came to a grim consensus. Humanity would be contained. A fleet would be dispatched to the Sol system, a force so massive it could crush any possible defense. The humans would be offered a simple choice: surrender unconditionally or be annihilated. It was standard procedure. The Vithkai had done this dozens of times before. Most species folded the moment they saw the warships filling their skies. The few that resisted were made into cautionary tales. Either way, the problem was solved. Executive Vethal began planning the operation. An armada of 6 carrier groups was brought together, a force not seen in almost 2,000 years, all for a single, supposedly primitive star system. It was 12,000 warships, from nimble attack craft to planet-killing battleships. It was a statement, designed to end the fight before it could even start. But as he watched the preparations, Rethanos felt a deep pit of unease in his stomach. This didn't feel right. If the humans had been hiding their work for a century, they had to have known this day would come. So, what was their plan for when the Vithkai fleet showed up on their doorstep? He found himself poring over the old records. The Kasari, the Yolm, the Singing Moons, all the civilizations they had contained over the millennia. None of them ever saw it coming. None were ever ready. But the humans were different. They had been watching. They had been learning. They had specifically studied what happened to species that got too powerful too quickly. Would they really have gone to all this trouble if they didn't think they had a real shot at winning? The fleet left Vithkai space with a massive empire-wide broadcast. Citizens cheered as the colossal ships warped into faster-than-light travel. They were proud of their empire's strength. The official story was a stabilization effort to deal with potential security concerns. Nobody used the word containment out loud, but everyone knew what it meant. Back at the capital, Rethanos coordinated his intelligence network, his scouts tracking the fleet's progress. The journey would take 23 days. 23 days was a lifetime by galactic standards. It was more than enough time for humanity to get ready. Rethanos found himself dreading the answer to his own question. What, exactly, would the fleet find when it finally arrived? From the bridge of his warship, Rethanos sneered at the humans' pathetic attempts at deception. They had set up so-called astronomical research stations all over, generating so much static it was almost funny. Now he saw them for what they were: a flimsy curtain trying to blind his unstoppable Vithkai fleet. For days, his 12,000 warships had sliced through the silent dark between stars. Every report that came in was the same: nothing. The humans, in their diplomatic channels, sounded confused, maybe a little concerned, but not scared. And that was the one thing that gnawed at Rethanos. If a fleet that could crack his planet in half was headed his way, he'd be more than scared. He'd be on his knees, begging, promising anything to turn the tide. But the humans, nothing. On the 19th day, as the fleet dropped to slower speeds and slid into their solar system, the human defense stations started squawking, sending formal protests and demanding to know what was going on. The fleet commander simply ignored them. By day 21, they were orbiting Neptune, well within range of Earth. The commander sent the standard message, the one that had broken empires: surrender unconditionally, or be erased from existence. The reply didn't come from Earth. It came from a tiny little ship, barely bigger than one of his scout craft, positioned defiantly between his fleet and the inner planets. The ship was small, but its message hit like a sledgehammer. Your fleet has been detected and is being tracked. We advise you to halt your advance and wait. We'll send you a location and a time for clarification. The message included coordinates to a patch of empty space way out past Neptune and a timestamp for just a few hours away. Fleet Commander Vithsara was more annoyed than anything. This wasn't the terrified plea for mercy he was expecting. But hey, what was the harm in taking a look before starting the fireworks? Maybe the humans had some secret toy they thought was a bargaining chip. He ordered the long-range sensors to focus on the spot. For hours, there was nothing. Just cold, dark, empty space. Then, at the exact second of the timestamp, something happened. Vithsara's sensor officers started shouting, their voices cracking with confusion. The readings made no sense. Something was ripping its way out of a fold in space, but the size couldn't be right. The sensors were screaming that the numbers were impossible. The object just kept coming. It took almost a full hour for it to emerge completely, shifting from some hidden dimension into normal space. When it finally settled, Vithsara felt the blood drain from his face. He finally understood. It was a ship bigger than any planet in this system, except for the gas giants. Its hull was so vast it had its own horizon, and its surface, it was covered in weapons, thousands of them, each one pulsing with more power than anything in his fleet's entire database. As Vithsara stared, paralyzed with a horror he'd never known, more signatures began popping up all over the system. 1, 2, 5, 10, a total of 12. 12 identical ships, each one a monster. Each one carrying enough firepower to turn his entire invasion force into dust 100 times over. The human message came again, this time from the colossal vessel hanging right in front of him. Your fleet is outmatched. We invite you to send a representative aboard to talk. We would prefer peace, but we are ready for war. The choice is yours. Vithsara looked at his tactical display. 12 planet-sized warships had his fleet in a cage. He had come here to put a leash on a minor species. Instead, he'd just discovered that the entire balance of power in the galaxy had been turned upside down. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking, he opened a channel to the Vithakai capital. Rethanos had to know. The High Council had to know. Everyone had to know what the humans had been hiding. They had been getting ready for this moment for a century, and they had prepared very, very well. The crew on his bridge moved like ghosts, their faces pale, as they ran scan after scan, hoping the data would change. It didn't. The 12 behemoths just sat there, so massive they were generating their own gravity. Initial analysis complete, Commander, his second-in-command, Rethkai, said, her voice trembling. The vessels are fully operational. Each one carries more firepower than our entire armada combined. Vithsara took the news without flinching, though inside his world was shattering. He'd been a commander for 400 years and had never seen anything like this. Where did they come from? How did they build these things without us knowing? He whispered. Rethkai shook her head. Unknown, sir. The hull material, the power source, it's all new. As for how they hid them, They must have built them in the dead spaces between stars, places we never bothered to look because we assumed they were empty. Vithsara turned back to the main screen. The closest human ship hung in space like a metal moon, its surface twinkling with thousands of lights. "They want to talk," he said quietly. "They invited me aboard." "It could be a trap, Commander," Rethkai protested. "If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead," Vithsara replied. "Whatever those weapons are, we can't stop them." He took a deep breath. "Prepare my shuttle. I'm going myself." "But sir, Protocol didn't plan for this," he snapped. "We came here to conquer primitives. Instead, we found a sleeping giant. I need to know what we're up against." The shuttle ride over felt like an eternity. As they got closer, the sheer size of the human ship was overwhelming. What looked like tiny bumps from a distance were actually massive structures, entire cities built into the vessel's skin. A docking bay yawned open, big enough to swallow a dozen of his cruisers without a problem. As he stepped out, a human delegation was waiting. At its head was a woman in a simple uniform, her expression calm and confident. "Fleet Commander Vithsara," she said, her voice steady. "I'm Admiral Chen Huayan. Welcome aboard the Prometheus." Vithsara looked her over. Humans always seemed so fragile, but this one had eyes of steel. "You'll forgive me if we skip the pleasantries," he said, trying to sound intimidating. "I have 12,000 warships waiting for me. I need to know what's going on." Admiral Wan just nodded. "Of course. Walk with me. It'll be easier to show you." They walked through hallways that felt miles long. Humans bustled past them, barely giving the alien commander a second glance. It was unsettling. "You've been planning this for a long time," Vithsara stated. 93 years, she replied. 3 generations, all working in secret. "Why?" he asked. Juan stopped at a massive viewport. Below them was an entire city, stretching out under an artificial sky, all inside the ship. "We want to survive," she said simply. "That's it. We looked out at the galaxy and saw what happens to species like ours. Powerful races like yours either contain us or destroy us. There's never a third option." "So you built these weapons to threaten us?" Vithsara asked. Admiral Wan looked him right in the eye. "We built these weapons to make threatening us too expensive. We don't want a war. We never did. But we learned a long time ago that the only way to guarantee peace is to have the power to defend it." And in that moment, Vithsara understood. The humans hadn't built a weapon. They had built a future. What really bothered him was just how ready they were. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your technology was primitive. Your resources were practically non-existent. How did you manage to build any of this?" The human admiral, Chen, gave a small smile. "We found new roads your people never thought to travel. Your science is ancient, Commander. It hasn't really changed in millions of years. You discovered what worked and just stopped looking for something better. We didn't have that luxury. We had to find better, so we did." She led him into another part of the ship, a massive chamber filled with machinery he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Crystals, the size of skyscrapers, pulsed with raw, contained energy. Strange devices hummed with a power so immense it made his skin tingle right through his environmental suit. "This is just one of our main power cores," Chen explained calmly. "It puts out more energy than your entire home world uses in a year, and we have dozens of these on every single one of our ships." "That's impossible," Vithsara stammered. "The physics of it." "The physics as you understand them, she corrected gently. But physics isn't some fixed set of rules. There are always deeper truths to find. Your people stopped digging, Hanaru. We just kept going. For the first time in centuries, Vatsara felt a chilling sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a child. Genuine, gut-wrenching uncertainty. He had been raised to believe, without question, that the Vithkai were the most advanced species in the entire galaxy. Every part of his culture screamed this truth. The epic victories carved into the walls of their sacred council chamber, the colossal fleets that enforced their will across the stars, the literal billions of years of history that proved their absolute superiority. But as he stood on this impossible ship, looking at technology that made his own civilization's greatest achievements look like children's toys, he started to wonder if that entire belief system had been a lie. "Show me your weapons," he demanded, his voice low. Chen paused for a second, then gave a slow nod. "All right. But I need you to understand, Commander. I'm showing you this not as a threat, but as an explanation. I want you to know exactly what you're up against, so you can make a smart choice about what happens next." They journeyed to the front of the ship, traveling through miles of corridors and lift tubes. At last, they stepped onto an observation deck that looked out onto a structure so unbelievably massive it filled the entire view. "This," Chen said, her voice soft, "is our primary stellar manipulation array. It's designed to influence stars. We can make them burn hotter or cooler, trigger solar flares, or, in a worst-case scenario, make one go supernova or collapse it into a black hole." Vatsara just stared at the array. Even to his untrained eye, its purpose was terrifyingly clear. He could see the focusing elements, the massive power conduits, the intricate targeting systems. This wasn't a weapon designed for fighting other ships. This was a weapon for fighting entire civilizations. You could wipe out our entire empire with this," he said, his voice barely audible. "Oh, yes," Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Each of our 12 ships has one just like it. If we decided to, we could sterilize every single world in Vithkai space in just a few decades. Everything your people have built over 18,000 years could be gone." "Then why haven't you?" Vatsara demanded, turning to her. "If you have this kind of power, why are you talking to me? Why not just get rid of us and eliminate the threat?" Chen turned to face him, her gaze direct. Her eyes were like steel, but not unkind. "Because that's not who we are. We built these weapons to stop wars, not to start them. We have no interest in hurting your people. We just want to be left alone. And you expect me to believe that? A species builds the power to shatter civilizations and then claims they have no aggressive plans. I expect you to believe what makes the most sense, Commander. If we wanted you destroyed, we would have done it long before your fleet ever got here. The fact that we chose to reveal ourselves and open a dialogue instead, well, that should tell you everything you need to know about our intentions." Sara was quiet for a long time. Everything she said was perfectly logical. Everything she had shown him backed up her claims, and yet it was so hard to accept. His entire view of the universe was built on the idea that the Vithkai were supreme, that they were the masters of the galaxy, that no one could ever challenge them. In the span of an hour, that foundation had been utterly shattered. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "If not a war, then what?" "Peace," she said simply. "Real peace, not the kind you enforce with fear and domination. We want to take our place in the galactic community as equals. We want the right to grow and thrive without the threat of being contained hanging over our heads. We want the same chance every other species deserves. And if we say no, then we will defend ourselves, Chen stated plainly. These weapons exist so that we never have to fire them. But if we're forced to choose between being wiped out and fighting back, we will fight, and we will win. It wasn't a boast. It was just a simple statement of fact, delivered without a trace of anger or pride. And Vithsara believed her. I need to contact my government, he said. They have to know what I've seen here. Of course, Chen agreed. We'll give you complete documentation of our capabilities. We want the Vithkai to make a fully informed decision. We want you to understand that working together is the only path forward that makes any sense. They walked back to the docking bay where his shuttle was waiting. As Vithsara got ready to board, Chen spoke one last time. Commander, I just want you to know this was never personal. We don't hate your people. We just refused to accept the box that galactic history tried to put us in. We refused to sit around and wait for the day when some other power decided we were becoming a threat. We seized control of our own destiny. Vithsara nodded slowly. You've given us a lot to think about, Admiral. I hope your faith in a peaceful outcome is well placed. So do I, Commander. So do I. The shuttle carried him back toward his flagship. As it flew, he looked out at the colossal human vessels hanging silently in space, dwarfing his own fleet. Each one was a monument to a century of secret development. Each one was a declaration that the old way of doing things was officially over. He had no idea what the circle of executives would decide. He didn't know if Vithkai pride would even allow them to accept this new reality without a fight. But he knew one thing for sure. The galaxy was never going to be the same. Once he reached his flagship, he immediately opened a secure channel to the capital. The face of High Executive Rethanos appeared on the screen, his gray features tight with worry. Report, Commander. We're getting your sensor data, but we can't make sense of what we're seeing. Vithsara took a deep breath. High Executive, I've just been aboard one of the human ships. I've seen what they can do with my own eyes. We need to assemble the full circle, immediately. How bad is it? Vithsara glanced at his tactical display, at the 12 planet-sized ships surrounding his fleet like sharks circling their prey. It's worse than you can possibly imagine, he said, and better than we deserve. They're offering peace. I strongly suggest we take it. The transmission cut out. Vithsara sat alone on his bridge, waiting for the decision that would seal the fate of his entire civilization. Outside, the human ships maintained their silent watch. They had waited 100 years for this moment. They could wait a little longer. The emergency session of the Circle of Executives raged for 3 solid days. Arguments screamed through the ancient chamber as the 7 most powerful Vithkai in the galaxy tried to wrap their minds around what Commander Vithsara's reports were telling them. Some of them were calling for an immediate attack. The humans are bluffing, they insisted. No species could build something like this in secret. It has to be a trick, some kind of hologram or illusion meant to scare us. The Vithkai should call their bluff and remind them of our power. High Executive Rethanos listened to all of it and said nothing. He had pored over the data more carefully than anyone. He'd seen the energy signatures, the gravitational distortions, the detailed scans that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the human ships were horrifyingly real. This was not a bluff. The humans had somehow, impossibly, created weapons that made the Vithkai's entire arsenal look obsolete. On the second day, he finally stood up to speak. "We have two choices," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "We can accept the human offer of peace and learn to live in a galaxy where we are no longer the supreme power, or we can fight them and risk the annihilation of everything we have built over 18,000 years. "You want us to surrender?" demanded Executive Cathal, outraged. "To bow down to these primitives who've only been traveling in space for 3 centuries? I would have us survive," Rethanos shot back. "Pride is a luxury we can no longer afford. The humans have offered us fair terms. They don't want to rule us or destroy us. They simply want to exist without being threatened. Is that really so unreasonable? It sets a dangerous precedent. If we agree to this, every minor species in the galaxy will think they can challenge us," another executive yelled. "No," Rethanos countered. "Every minor species in the galaxy will see what happens when one of them manages to develop the power to defend itself. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the old ways have run their course." The debate raged on, but slowly, painfully, the atmosphere in the chamber began to change. One by one, the other executives came to accept the terrifying truth. Rethanos was right. A fight was not an option. The humans had made absolutely sure of that. On the third day, the Circle voted. The result was unanimous. The Vithkai would accept the human proposal. Admiral Chen Lin got the news in the command center of the flagship, Prometheus. She had been waiting for 3 days, barely getting any sleep, just watching the Vithkai fleet hovering just outside her weapons range. When the message finally arrived, she allowed herself a small, tired smile. It was over. A century of hard work, a century of sacrifice. It had all paid off. Humanity was finally safe. She opened a channel to the Vithkai flagship. "Fleet Commander Vithsara, we've received your government's decision. We are pleased to accept their offer of peaceful negotiation." Vithsara's face appeared on her screen. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in 3 days either. "Admiral Chen," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of history, "my government has authorized me to begin formal discussions. We would like to establish the terms of our new relationship. I'm ready to meet whenever you are, Commander. And thank you. I know this wasn't an easy call for your people. It took real courage to choose peace." Sara gave a slow nod. "It took fear, Admiral. Fear of what would happen if we didn't. But maybe fear is a decent starting point for peace. It seems to have worked for your species, after all." Over the next few weeks, the talks unfolded aboard the Prometheus. Vithkai officials came and went, every single one of them visibly stunned by the sheer scale of what humanity had created. Treaties were written, torn up, and rewritten. New rules for a new galaxy began to take shape. The heart of the deal was actually pretty simple. Humanity would be recognized as a full-fledged member of the galactic community, with all the rights and privileges that came with it. They'd get a seat on the concord of aligned species, and would be free to grow and expand however they saw fit. In return, humanity offered something nobody had ever seen before. The Prometheus fleet would act as the guarantors of peace for the entire galaxy. Any species that was facing a threat that could wipe them out would have humanity step in to help. The days of containing troublesome species were officially over. That last part stirred up the most trouble. The Vithkai had used containment as a weapon of power for thousands of years. Giving that up meant they could no longer just crush any threat that popped up. But when it came down to it, they didn't have a choice. Humanity now had the muscle to back up their demands. The only question left was what kind of galaxy they wanted to build. Word of the new treaty spread like wildfire. Within days, every species in the galaxy knew what went down. The reactions were a mixed bag. The Arathi, those ancient, crystalline beings, were the first to reach out to humanity directly. They had survived for millions of years by making themselves useful to whoever was in charge. Now, they saw a chance to be more than just servants. "We have watched the Vithkai rule for millennia," their ambassador said in his first meeting. "They weren't cruel, but they were definitely the masters. We were never truly free. Maybe with you, things can be different." The Hollow Minds, those giant intelligences who had once written off humanity as a cosmic joke, actually issued a rare public statement. They admitted their calculations had missed a variable they never even thought to consider: the power of a species to completely change its own destiny through sheer force of will. "We calculated probabilities based on what we'd seen before," they said. "Humanity acted differently. We're adding this new data to our models. It's interesting." Other reactions weren't so friendly. Some species saw humanity's sudden rise as a danger, not an opportunity. They had gotten comfortable with the old way of doing things, even if it meant being on the bottom rung forever. Change was terrifying. A few even tried to fight the new reality. A coalition of smaller powers, secretly cheered on by some old-school Vithkai loyalists, launched a sneak attack on a human colony world. They figured all this talk about peace meant humanity didn't have the stomach for a real fight. They were dead wrong. The Prometheus showed up within hours, its enormous shadow covering the sky over the colony. The attacking fleet was given one chance to back off. When they said no, a single weapon fired. It wasn't one of the star-killing arrays, nothing that dramatic. Just a good old-fashioned weapons blast that turned their lead ship into dust in a blink. The rest of the fleet gave up on the spot. After that, nobody else tried to challenge them. The galaxy finally got the message. Humanity's offer of peace was real, but so was their willingness to fight for it. Years went by. The Prometheus fleet spread out across the galaxy, setting up posts near major star systems. They didn't make threats. They didn't meddle in local politics. They just were. A quiet, constant reminder that the rules of the game had changed. Admiral Chen Huayan stayed in command of the Prometheus until her 92nd birthday. She had spent her whole life getting ready for a war that never happened. And in the end, she was more than okay with that. On her last day, she took one final walk through the ship's corridors. So many memories, so many people who had given so much. Her grandmother, who spent decades putting on a smile for aliens while secretly fighting to protect her people. Her mother, who had died building the very engines that powered this incredible ship. All the millions who had given their lives for a dream they would never get to see. She paused at the massive viewport that looked out over the main weapons array. Those terrifying tools of destruction, built with the hope they would never have to be used. And they had worked perfectly. They had made all-out war a crazy idea. Her replacement, Admiral David Park, found her standing there. He was the same young officer from those tense first days, now with silver in his hair and medals from a dozen different species on his chest. "The shuttle is ready, Admiral," he said gently. "Earth is waiting for you." Yin nodded, but didn't move. "David, do you remember what I told you on your first day on this ship? You said we weren't building weapons. We were building a future. Do you think we did it?" Park gazed out at the stars sprinkled beyond the glass. "I think we changed things, Admiral. Whether it lasts, well, that's up to the next generation. But we gave them a shot. That's more than most species ever get." Wyan smiled. It was true. They had given humanity a chance. More than that, they had given every species in the galaxy a chance to live without the constant fear of being wiped out by their neighbors. She took one last long look at the ship that had been her home for 30 years, then turned and headed for the shuttle bay. Behind her, Prometheus kept up its endless watch, waiting, watching, and protecting. Back on Earth, she was treated like a hero. Crowds lined up just to see the woman who had commanded humanity's ultimate weapon. Politicians gave speeches about her bravery and vision, but Wyan didn't care much for all the parties. What mattered to her was the world she saw all around her. Kids playing in the park without a shred of fear. Families making plans that reached beyond just surviving another year. Scientists tackling problems that weren't about war. Artists creating beautiful things without worrying if their civilization would be around long enough for anyone to see it. This was what it was all for. Not for power, not for revenge, but for the simple freedom to exist, to grow, and to become whatever humanity was meant to be. She spent her final years teaching at the academy for new Prometheus fleet officers. Young people from a dozen species came to learn from her. Humans, Vithkai, Arathi, and others, all working side by side for the same goal. "Why did humanity do it?" a student asked her one day. "You had the power to rule the entire galaxy. Why did you choose to protect it instead?" Wyan thought about that for a long moment. It was a fair question. Most species, if they had the kind of power humanity had built, would have used it to conquer everything. They would have become the very thing they once feared, just another empire in a never-ending cycle of violence. "Because we remembered what it was like to be scared," she finally answered. "We knew what it felt like to look up at the stars and see only enemies. We didn't want anyone else to ever feel that way again, not even the ones who were once our enemies." But the Vithkai oppressed so many species. They wiped out whole civilizations. Didn't they deserve to be punished? "Maybe," she said. "But punishment wouldn't have brought back the lost civilizations. It wouldn't have erased all the suffering. The only thing that could make a real difference was to change the future. So that's what we tried to do." The student nodded, still trying to wrap his head around it. That was okay. Some lessons take a whole lifetime to really sink in. Wyan passed away peacefully at the age of 107. By then, the galaxy was a completely different place. The Concord had been rebuilt into a true democratic body, where every species had an equal say. Fights still broke out, but they were small and ended quickly. Nobody wanted to get the attention of the Prometheus fleet. And out there, in the quiet darkness between the stars, the 12 ships kept their watch. They were monuments to a simple idea that humanity had learned the hard way and then taught the galaxy. Power without kindness is just another word for tyranny. But power used to protect others. Power used to give everyone a chance to grow. Now, that was something worth having. That was something worth the century of sacrifice it took to get there. The galaxy had looked at humanity and seen a minor species, easy to ignore, easy to trap. They were wrong. Humanity had looked at the galaxy and seen a broken system built on fear. They decided to fix it. And they did. The stars kept on shining, not caring one bit about the little creatures zipping between them. But those creatures weren't so little anymore, and the future they were building together was brighter than anyone could have ever dreamed. This was humanity's real gift to the galaxy. It wasn't weapons, and it wasn't power. It was just the simple, radical idea that things could be better, and they were.